The games people play. This is the sermon that was and is still yet to come, because this is a redo. This was the sermon that I was supposed to preach the week that I got sick and Rich was pressed into duty. And so we moved it down the line, and we're going to do it. And maybe you cheated that week and you came up here and you peeked at the slides after service and you filled in the blanks, so you're already all set to go. But that's okay. We're gonna still go through this. We've been looking at these board games. And I got to tell you, board games were a big part of my childhood, because I had friends in the neighborhood and we had sisters, and when the weather started getting cold and Mom wouldn't let you go out and do crazy stuff, you had to find some way to occupy yourself, and there were no video games when I was a kid, so we played board games. And our game room has gotten kind of smaller. We're down to 2. We have Battleship this week, and we're going to talk about Perfection next week. But games, they're about winning. They're about competition. If you ever played a game with a person that just is so intense about it, they just won't lose. And if they do lose, they get upset. We have a name for them. We call them poor sports. And I guess that's kind of the nature of games. If you're a competitive person, and games probably aren't a good pastime for you because you don't like to lose. Because games, while they make competition, they also they can create conflict. And that's really what we're going to talk about this morning. We're going to talk about conflict. By the way, this is also the first sermon I've done about a month without a water bottle and without a cough drop. And I did it on purpose because I'm tired of them. So we'll just have to deal with maybe a little bit of coughing, because I just couldn't do it this morning. I'm tired of them. So this is about conflict. And conflict is really all about another word. It's about relationships. And conflict, well, it rips at our relationships, doesn't it? It causes us stress. And you know what? It even causes us to sin. You get in a conflict, and I'm guaranteeing you things will come out of your mouth that you just didn't think possible. You will say things, you will have body language, you may even do things that you just don't think is possible from you anymore. But that's what conflict does to us. So let's talk about this game of Battleship. Now, this is another one of those that is one of my favorites, because it is a game of strategy. The game begins with everybody gets 5 little boats. By the way, they changed it. Now it's 5 little boats and a man that stands on an island. Don't get the man on the island, but that's okay. You get 5 little boats in the classic edition. And then it used to be in the form of an L, like you see on the screen here, and you would put your boats in a certain area, and the person on the other side would put their boats in a certain area, and then you would start calling out letters and numbers, their coordinates on the board, in hopes of finding the other person's boats and sinking them before they sank yours. Pretty simple game. The game actually came to us, believe it or not, from France. We don't usually see them as a wars nation, but that's okay. It came to us under the name of a game called Salvo, was its original name, in 1931. This game's been here a long time. In 1967, Milton Bradley introduced the first version of the game called Battleship. So the first time we saw this thing was in the late 60s, and again, we know what was going on in the 60s. We were right in the middle of Vietnam and all the other things that were going on, the Cuban Missile Crisis. And so we had this idea of a conflict in our relationships. Not much different from this verse. James chapter 4, verses 1 and 2. What is the source of quarrels and conflicts among you? Is not the source your pleasure that wage war on your members? You lust, you do not have, so you commit murder. You are envious, and you cannot obtain, so you fight and quarrel. Interesting thing, James wrote that verse to a bunch of Christians. He wrote that verse to a bunch of people that were in a church, and he was observing them, and he said, you know what, you guys fight a lot. There's a lot of conflict in your church. And I want to get down to the root of the issue, and he talks about the idea of lust and the idea of lack and all these things. And it's kind of interesting, if you go out into our society, that's what you see today. Most crime is committed because of lust, desire. or lack. You want and you don't have. So we have this conflict of battleship going. We have this idea that I'm going to take from you because I don't have or because I desire. And of course, because I take from you, then that gives you permission to do what? You take from me. And back and forth we go, and we wage this war. And it isn't always about money, and it isn't always about cars, and it isn't always about property. These conflicts can come up just because of a personality. These conflicts can come up over authority. You have authority, I want it, so I'm going to wage war against you to get it. It can come up over a seat in a church, parking space in a parking lot. I mean, we can find the silliest things to start arguments over in a church. You just can't believe it. You know, Al Michaels has got a book coming out this week. I'm a big sports fan, and I heard this on the radio. He's got a book coming out about the sports world, and the title of it is You Can't Make This Stuff Up. And we could probably put out the same thing in a church. You just can't make this stuff up sometimes, what people fight about in the church. It's kind of silly. So this morning, though, we're going to talk about another word, surrender. It's when you wave the little white flag and you're done the battle, when all of your ships are sunk and you have nothing to do except for give up. Well, the battle has to end. And so this morning, what I hope to do and what I hope to accomplish with this sermon is a little more practical than you usually get from a sermon that I do. We're going to look at how to end the battle before the ship sinks. How to stop the quarrels, how to stop the battles, how to end the conflict without taking damage to the other person's ship. Well, I think that would be very useful in our world today. Especially in a time of the season when families are going to get together, and you know what? There's always conflict in families. You know, you look forward to getting together to have those meals, but you're not so much looking forward to spending like the 3 days after the meal hanging out together. It just doesn't work well. So we're going to do some practical instructions today on how to end the conflicts in your life. And you can just go ahead and turn to Matthew chapter 5 because that's where we're going to be today. Because Jesus does a wonderful sermon. I didn't have to do a lot of planning for this sermon. Because Jesus did a wonderful job of laying out a sermon on how to end conflict in your life. So we're going to begin with don't act in anger. This is what verses 21 through 26 say. You have heard that it was said that people long ago, you shall not murder, and anyone who murders will be subject to judgment. But I tell you that anyone who is angry with a brother or sister will be subject to judgment. Again, anyone who says to his brother or sister, Raka, which is answerable in court as you fool, will be in danger of the fire of hell. Therefore, if you are offering your gift at the altar, and remember your brother or sister has something against you, leave your gift there in front of the altar first, go and reconcile to them, then come and offer your gift. Settle matters quickly with your adversary who is taking you to court. Do it while you are still together on the way, or your adversary may hand you over to the judge, and the judge may hand you over to the officer, and you may be thrown into prison. Truly I tell you, you will not get out until you have paid the last penny. So we have Jesus giving these instructions to these people, and the first thing he tells us is, you know what, holding grudges is going to sink your ship. Harboring bitterness and anger toward another person, well, it's just going to sink the relationship. If you harbor that inside of you, you know what? Every time you see that person, even though you put on the smiliest face you can, inside you're being torn up. That battle is starting. That's the way this works. He tells us a misspoken word doesn't condemn the one you're talking to. It condemns the speaker. He tells us that, you know what? You look at people and call them fools. You look at people and call them names. You come up with ways to criticize people. It doesn't say that it hurts them. Remember the old saying, sticks and stones may break my bones, but words never hurt, at least unless you're in the Geico commercial. You know, words really don't hurt you physically. They can hurt you emotionally, but the person that really gets hurt from those words coming out is the person that speaks them. A youth minister told me the story one time, and I'm sure he stole the story. I'm going to steal it from him. about the little boy that had a problem with his tongue, always saying things without thinking. So one day his granddad took him out into the woods along with a feather pillow. And when they got out into the woods on this windy day, he had the young man rip the pillow open and shake it until all the feathers were gone. Then he instructed the boy, please go gather all the feathers. The boy looked at his grandfather and said, that's impossible. His grandfather says, so it is with all of the words that you speak out of your mouth. Once they're out there, you can't go back and collect them. It's impossible. Even if you apologize, you say, I'm sorry, you do something, you can't take the words back. It's empty and worthy and worthless. James tells us, we put bits in the mouths of horses, we make them obey us, we can turn the whole animal. We take ships by example, and although they are large and driven by a strong wind, they are steered by a very small rudder, whatever the pilot wants to go. Likewise, the tongue is a small part of the body, but it makes great boast. Consider what a great forest is set on fire by a small spark. The tongue is also a fire, a world of evil among the parts of the body. It corrupts the whole body and sets the whole course of one's life on fire, and itself set on fire by hell. There's an interesting idea here that what comes out of your mouth is going to impact everything in your life. Be careful of that tongue. It can do a lot of damage very quickly. Here's the other thing I find interesting in this verse. People that are accountants, they don't like this very much, especially if you handle the church books. God values your relationship more than he values your gift. He says if you come to church and you have a gift to give, and you remember that you've got conflict with a brother or sister in your life, leave the gift, go and settle the conflict, because God doesn't want the gift until the conflict is settled. That's pretty serious business. God is saying here, I would rather you not give me another dime and set all of your relationships straight than to open up your checkbook and make great big gifts. God is more interested in our relationship with people than he is about the money in our checkbook. That's a big deal to me. Because that means God is not impressed by what I give. He's impressed by how I deal with people. God doesn't value just your money. A quick solution is better than a long-running feud. I have to share this story with you. I tried to rack my brain as to whether or not I ever shared it with you. When we got to the church that we came from, we got there and there were 6 Sunday school classes, all with members that were 65 and over. And they were spread out all through the building. And it was kind of amusing because I made my way on the education team, and we had to figure out a way to start using our building smarter. So we decided, well, you know what? We don't really need 6 classes to have 4 or 5 people each in it. So maybe what we want to do is we want to start consolidating these 6 classes back together. You know what we found out? There was a reason there were 6 classes. There were 6 classes because this person didn't agree with that person. And so they split the class up because, and you know what the funny thing we found out? Most of the people were dead. And they were still carrying the grudges and conflicts. And we really got it down to 2 classes. And when we had it down to 2, literally, when we finally combined those 2, I kid you not, they went into the same classroom. And this class sat over here and this class sat over here. And they wouldn't talk to each other. I'm like, oh my gosh, you've got to be kidding me. They had all of this harboring feud, and so we finally got the people together, and they didn't even know what they were fighting about anymore. But all they knew is that somewhere in the past, this grudge had started, and they'd been holding it and following these 2 camps, and now there was division and there was quarreling. The Bible tells us in Ephesians chapter 4:26, in your anger, do not sin. Do not let the sun go down while you are still angry. I'm glad it says that, because it says don't go. I hear people quote that, don't go to bed while you're angry. That's not what it says, because sometimes I probably never go to bed. It says don't even let the sun go down. If somebody wrongs you or you're holding something in your heart or you've got an issue with somebody, don't even let the sun set before you go talk to them. Don't even let a day pass. That's a big deal. I think if we dealt with our anger in this way, that we were open and honest, and we dealt with people in a loving manner, and we started resolving our conflicts and our anger when it was fresh, when it could be resolved instead of allowing it to fester inside of us, I think a lot of our quarrels would go away, don't you think? And for those that don't, well, it kind of falls into this next category that Jesus talks about. Don't look in lust. Verses 27 and 30 through 30 say, You have heard that it was said, You shall not commit adultery. But I say to you that everyone who looks at a woman with lust for her has already committed adultery with her in his heart. If your right eye makes you stumble, tear it out and throw it from you. For it is better for you to lose one part of your body than the whole body is to be thrown into hell. If your right eye makes you stumble, if your right hand makes you stumble, cut it off and throw it from you. For it is better that you lose one of the parts of your body than your whole body be sent to hell. That's an interesting idea. Jesus is talking about what you do versus what you think about here. You see, intention is just as deadly as action. You see, once I look, and he uses the idea of adultery, and I'm going to kind of use it for something that maybe we more struggle with. Once I look at the car going down the road, and I start admiring the pretty car, and I start thinking about how I would look driving the car, you know what's probably going to happen? I'm going to buy the car. You see, this is what marketing people figured out a long time ago. Watch the commercials. If I can get you to see yourself using the product, then odds are I'm going to sell you the product. It's the oldest marketing trick in the book. That's why you see people that are always happy using the product. That's why you always see people that are always fit. My Battleship just sung. Okay, maybe God's trying to tell us something here. This is an important point. Be careful what you look at. You have to be disciplined. That's a big deal. You know what? The discipline he talks about, he's kind of very, very, very stern about this. You know what? If your eye begins to wander, just pluck it on out of there. You have to be disciplined in your lifestyle. You have to begin to look at things in a disciplined manner, not in a wanting manner. See, I do. My kids fuss and my wife fuss that I'm the hardest person on the Christmas list because I don't ever have anything on my list. Well, I have wants. It's just they're not the kind of wants that I usually express that you can go buy at a store. I have dreams and things that I want to do with my life, and sometimes those wants begin to get into my life, and they cause me to do things I shouldn't. I have to be disciplined about it. You know what? Not only do I have to be disciplined, we have to be deliberate. Now, if you're not going to lust, you have to know your weaknesses. I mean, if you have a struggle with alcohol, you know where you don't go? You don't go to bars. If you have a struggle with pornography, then you don't go where there's pornography. If you have struggle with compulsive buying, don't go shopping by yourself with a credit card in your hand. It's not going to work out well for you. You see, a lot of times we look at it this way. We're like, God's not going to let me sin. 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 Oh, there it is. God, you let me sin. We just keep moving toward it so very casually that then when we sin, it's inevitable. It says we're supposed to flee youthful lust. We're not supposed to be going there. We're not supposed to be deliberate for what we're doing. Then we get this point we're supposed to be drastic. That's interesting. He says we're supposed to be drastic in what we're doing. How drastic was he? Cut off your hand, pluck out your eye. You know what? Be better for you to walk down the street with a visor over your eyes than to start lusting. Be better for you to never go shopping again and your clothes to be a little worn and tattered than to put yourself in a situation where you're going to run up the credit card debt. Sometimes you have to do drastic things. Drastic situations call for drastic measures. That's how Jesus saw this idea. See, we try to solve lust by feeding it, don't we? We come to the conclusion that if I can just get enough, if I can just do this, if I can just have that one more thing, then all of this lust issue will go away. But you know what we found out through the years, don't you? As soon as you get that one more thing and you don't find happiness in it, guess what you need? One more thing. That's how lust works. And Jesus is saying you have to put a stop to it. You can't live that way, or you're going to live in conflict. And this is the worst conflict of all because it lives within you. Here's another good one that we need to remember. Don't make promises you won't keep. Verses 33 through 37 read, Again, you have heard that the ancients were told, you are not to make false vows, but you shall fulfill your vows to the Lord. But I say to you, make no oath at all, either by heaven, for by the throne of God, or by the earth, for it is the footstool of his feet, or by Jerusalem, for it is the city of the great king. Nor shall you make an oath by your head, for you cannot make one hair white or black. But let your statement be yes or no. Anything beyond these is evil. This is an interesting idea here. Don't make promises you can't keep. Now, it doesn't say don't make promises you don't intend to keep, because I want to tell you something. I don't believe most people, a rational mind, make promises they don't intend to keep. Usually when you tell somebody you're going to do something, you have the intention to do it. But Jesus takes it a step further here. Don't make promises you won't keep. Here's what he's saying. It's not about lying, it's about overcommitting. How many people do you know that you've made promise after promise and you've sectioned up your time and your calendar to the point that you can't possibly keep all the promises? You can't do it. So there's a warning here. Don't overcommit your life. Be good stewards of your time. We always talk about stewardship when it comes to our money. Be good stewards of your time. Don't put so much of yourself out there that there's nothing left. I wonder how many marriages end because of the overcommitment of time from the spouses everywhere else. And then one day you wake up and you realize you don't even know each other because you spent no time with each other. It's not about lying. It's about overcommitting. Here's something you need to remember. A broken vow voids a relationship. One of those things they teach you in youth minister school. You plan an event, you cancel one event on a teenager, and it takes you a dozen good events to make up for the one canceled. That's what they teach you. That's the way it works. Why? Because when you canceled that event, you lost their trust. And so you have to earn it back one step at a time. When you make a vow, when you make a promise, then you know what? If you break that promise, you will void the trust in the relationship instantly. And while the person may never say it, and the person may say, it's okay, I understand, you know what? They don't. It voids the relationship because the next promise you make, the people have to begin to wonder, are you going to keep that one? And if you break that one, then they really begin to wonder, are you going to keep the next one? That's the way it works. And that's the way conflict grows. Consistency ends conflict. If you are what you are, and your yes is yes, and your no is no, and you become dependable in your life, and when you tell somebody, this is what I'm going to do, and you do it, they may not always like you. Okay? They may not always be friends with you. They may not always be pleased with your actions, but the conflict isn't going to be there because you know what? You're consistent. We've been watching the NFL season, and if you're an avid fan like myself, the referees are driving you crazy this year because they seem to be flagging some penalties for this team and not penalties for this team. It looks like the same penalty to me, and I'm like, what are you doing? And the players are sitting there complaining because there's no consistency in what's being done because they feel like there's favoritism going on. Consistency ends all of that. If everybody can count on what you say out of your mouth goes into your life, conflict goes away. See, he tells us, let your statement be yes, no, but never maybe so. What you say you're going to do, that's what you do. What you say you aren't going to do, that's what you don't do. You make commitments that are manageable and keepable. It would be better for you to tell somebody, I can't get that done, than to promise you're going to get it done and it not get done. That's conflict. Here's another thing that we need to remember, and this is a big one. Don't get even. I never understood that word because you never do really get even, do you? Even if somebody does something to you and you find a way to get revenge on them, it's really never even because they feel like they have to get revenge for the revenge, and then the whole thing keeps going. Verses 38 through 42 says, You have heard that it was said, an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth. But I say to you, do not resist an evil person, but whoever slaps you on the right cheek, turn to him the other cheek also. If anyone wants to sue you and take your shirt, let him have your coat also. Whoever forces you to go 1 mile with him, go 2. Give to him who asks of you. Do not turn away from him who wants to borrow from you. And I'm looking at that, I'm thinking that doesn't make good financial sense. Okay, I'm a bottom line kind of guy. I mean, Jesus tells us an eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth. And I move that as a question mark because a lot of us, we quote that scripture. We do. You know, somebody does something wrong, but well, the Bible says an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth. Well, you're quoting scripture, sort of. You pulled out a little bit. See, Jesus is saying that's the way that you were taught your entire life. Get even. Whatever somebody takes from you, you take from them. But then he goes into this. And I have problems with this. I mean, just look at this list. This is how Jesus says we're supposed to approach this. Turn the other cheek. If anyone wants to sue you and take your shirt, give him your coat also. If he forces you to go 1 mile, go 2. Don't turn away from those who want to borrow or ask of you. Do you think Jesus really meant that? I mean, am I really, if somebody smacks me across the face, am I really just supposed to stand there and say, here you go, hit the other side so they'll be even? Is that really what he's saying? See, I don't think literally that's what he was intending. I think he was using an extreme example to give us some extreme principles. As a matter of fact, he's going to give us 3. Here's the first one, the first principle that you need to see here. Do not respond in kind to evil to an evil person. You know, when somebody does you wrong and your first response is to get back at them, that's not the right response. See, because when you respond to evil with an evil person, if they're an evil person, guess what? They're better at evil than you are. So you're probably going to end up losing this battle. So Jesus is flat out telling you, you know what? Don't respond that way. You're not going to get anything from it. If you're responding with evil just because you're trying to get even, then you know what? Nothing's going to go well with that. He tells us, be prepared to offer kindness in adversity. That's what he's talking about here. If somebody tries to take your shirt, give them your coat also. The idea is be prepared that you're going to meet people out there that are going to try to take things from you. Be prepared to meet them with some kindness, some gentleness, not with skepticism. Use generosity and not judgment. That's important. There's an idea that's worth thinking about. Sometimes we're quick to judge and slow to be generous with what God has given us. So I have one more ship that I want us to look at. I'm actually not going to read that. I'm going to skip right here because I want to talk about not giving in. Don't give in. Verses 43 through 48. You have heard that it was said, you shall love your neighbor and hate your enemy. But I say to you, love your enemies and pray for those who persecute you, so that you may become sons of the Father who is in heaven. For he causes his sun to rise on the evil and the good, and sends rain to the righteous and unrighteous. For if you love those who love you, what reward do you have? Do not even the tax collectors do the same? If you greet only your brothers, what more are you doing than others? Do not even the Gentiles do the same? Therefore, you are to be perfect as your heavenly Father is perfect. See, we'll talk about that word perfect next week. But I want to talk about this idea of not giving in. God's standard is higher than the world's law. The world will tell you just love those that love you. Be nice to those that are nice to you. God says, you know what? That's a worldly standard. My standard is be nice to those in need, even those that have cursed you in the past. Those are the people that need you. Pray for your relationships. You want to end some conflict in your relationships? Here's one. Pray for that person. You know how hard it is to be mad at the person you're praying for? It's almost impossible if you're truly praying. You can't do it because God's going to just keep poking at you. You're not allowed to be mad at them. The whole idea of going to settle the conflict is going to come up. Forgive the unforgivable. That's hard. But that's exactly what Jesus is saying here. Forgive even the things you don't think it's possible to forgive. Offer it out there for people. He says we're supposed to be like our Father. Jesus wants us to handle our conflicts the same way he did. How did he handle his conflicts? Interesting enough, he handled them with a cross. Talk about forgiving the unforgivable. See, this whole idea of conflicts, it's a hit and miss thing. You can keep dealing with your conflicts the same way you're dealing with them. They can deliver a blow, and then you can deliver a blow. They can make it red because it was a direct hit, and maybe you'll be white because you were just kind of close to it. It's all a hit and miss thing. Maybe you'll get something out of it, maybe you won't. But here's what I want you to take out of this sermon. The only way the conflicts ever end isn't to keep playing the game of hit and miss. It's to play the game of surrender. I'm not talking about being a doormat. I'm not talking about letting people take advantage of you. I'm talking about using the principles that Jesus put right here in Matthew chapter 5 to approach the relationships in your life. It'll change you. And I got to tell you, I don't have these down perfect. I struggle with my anger. I struggle with the idea of lust. I struggle with the idea of just giving in something. All of these things that I'm telling you about, I struggle with the same conflicts in my relationships. Every single one of them. See, sometimes I have to remind myself that God has given me a blueprint for living my life. And anything outside the blueprint is nothing more than the game. That's a sobering thought. So I guess here's what I want to know. How do you want to deal with your relationships? Do you want to keep playing the game that you're playing? I know where to put your marriage. I know where to put your relationship with your kids. I know where to put your relationship with the person sitting in the pew behind you and next to you. I know where it will put everything. It'll put you in total conflict where Satan has you so distracted with what's going on, you just flat out will not be able to figure it out anymore. See, that's the goal of all of this. If Satan can keep you fighting with each other, whether that each other is a spouse or a parent-child or just people in the church, the more you have to fight, the less time you have to live for God. That's the game. That's Satan's goal. So this morning during decision time, I want you to begin to think, how do I want to do this going forward? Do I want to keep playing Battleship? Keep just going? Or do I want to try Jesus' way to surrender? Maybe you're here today, you don't know who this